Hey everyone, welcome back to the Code Wolf. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at how to authenticate to Azure OpenAI using Microsoft Entra ID, which was formerly known as Azure Active Directory. Now, there's a lot of content out there, including some of my own, that shows how to connect to OpenAI using access keys, but that's really not an ideal solution for more enterprise or production-ready environments. It's fine for getting started or for disposable tutorials or scenarios where you don't have another option, but ideally you'd want to set this up to not rely on secrets or access keys. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how to set that up and explore a few potential workflows to get all this working. Let's dive in. Please remember to hit subscribe and the like button to support the channel, and let's jump in. All right, so here we have this really simple AI-powered app, and this is basically a simplified version of an app that we built in some of my other content. So check out those videos if you want more information. But basically, we can just ask a question here. So I'll say, who is Mario? And when we submit, we'll get back a response from the OpenAI service out in Azure because this app is already hooked up to it. So if we look at the code here, again, you can check out my other videos for details on how all this works, but it's basically the simplest setup possible to talk to OpenAI right now. So we define a couple configuration variables here, and we create an OpenAI client to go out and talk to Azure, along with some completion options and our deployment name. So this is talking to a GPT-35 model called Wolf Pilot up here. And then we just finally go out and get those chat completions and display those in the browser when the user submits. So pretty simple. But the part that we're interested in for this video is this OpenAI key right here. So in a real app or in a production environment or a more enterprise setting, you really would not want to put your OpenAI keys directly in your code like this, or even in other places like configuration files. You just want to keep them out of your source code if possible. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that these OpenAI keys have much more global permissions than most apps or users will need to perform basic tasks like this. And second, our code gets checked into source control, and including secrets or keys in source control like this can cause all sorts of problems, or people might copy and paste this key where it doesn't belong, or the wrong people get access to it, and so on. It can just really become a mess and is not a great security practice in most cases. So instead, we want to move to Microsoft Entra ID. This service of Azure allows us to use role-based access control, or RBAC, to assign the minimum required permissions to a security principal, and that could be a user, a group, a managed identity, or a service principal, and so on. There's different types. And what's important about this is that it manages our identities and permissions across different environments and scopes, such as different subscriptions, resource groups, individual resources, prod, test, local. It handles all that for us. These identities are also managed by Azure in most cases, which eliminates admin tasks such as securely storing or rotating secret values, and so on. Now, I want to mention upfront that this is not going to be a deep dive into Microsoft Entra ID itself. I'm going to assume you either have some very basic familiarity with that service and some core concepts, or you're not familiar with it, but you just want to follow along to get your OpenAI system set up correctly. And this video does provide enough information for you to do that, even if you don't fully understand everything about Entra ID. So let's just walk through this one step at a time. And first off, we want to get this working locally using Microsoft Entra ID. Obviously, this is working locally right now, but it's using these keys. So first, let's just delete this OpenAI key so it's out of our source code entirely, and I'll stop the app so we're not running anymore. And then we can also just delete that variable out of here. And of course, now our Azure key credential won't be happy because that's expecting a key. But in its place, we can use something else here. We could use some sort of token-based credential that will work with Microsoft Entra ID. And a really simple solution to this is to use default Azure credential. And this is kind of a special class that works with Microsoft Entra ID. And so if we go out to the documentation, this default Azure credential essentially searches for and creates a token credential based on different environments. So it searches for these in order. So first it'll look to see if there's one in your environment variables, and then it'll check your workload identity, which we won't get into now. But this managed identity one that it checks for third, this is of interest to us because we can create a managed identity out in Azure for when we deploy our app. Now, for local concerns, like we just talked about, notice that this also checks for different IDE authentication. So we've got Visual Studio, we've got the Azure CLI, PowerShell, Developer CLI, and even an interactive browser. So whatever you're logged into locally, it can just take your credentials from there and give you access to the Azure resource using that. Then when we actually deploy our app to Azure, it can pick up a different credential automatically. So let's just see how this works in practice. So if I go back to Visual Studio, you'll see we've already updated this default Azure credential. Now, if we want this to work locally, that means two things need to happen. One is that we need to be logged in locally to one of those tools, so either the Azure CLI or Visual Studio in this case. And I'm already logged into Visual Studio up here, so you could take that approach. But if you are using the CLI, you could run a command such as az login, and that will launch you out to Azure, and you can sign in that way. But I'm already signed in, so I'm just going to jump back here. So whatever your tool of choice is locally, just log into that, and that's the first step. Now, the second step is that we have to go into our OpenAI service and grant access to that identity. And there's a couple different ways to do this. So let's go out to Azure. And so I have our OpenAI service here. So here's our CodeWolf OpenAI service that we're talking to. And if we go into access control, if we go under role assignments, right now there's not much set up here. There's just some miscellaneous things here from earlier testing. But we want to assign a role to either our identity or to a group that our identity lives in and give it the right permissions to access this service. Now, the benefit of using a group is that as more developers join your team, you can just add or remove people from the group that has the permissions assigned. And that creates a little bit more of a scalable solution where you don't have to kind of micromanage permissions on every person. So if we wanted to set that up, it's pretty simple. If we go to Microsoft Entra ID, and let's go up to Add Group. So we'll create a new group in Entra ID. And we'll call this Local AI Devs or something. And then for the description, we'll say devs who work with OpenAI, or Azure OpenAI. And then I'll click Create, and that group will get created. So if I go here and refresh, and this might take a second to pop in, but there it is. So now I'll click on this group, and let's say that I want to add a member. So I'm going to add myself to this. So I'll select that, and now we'll refresh again. And so now I'm in this AD group. Now that's great, but right now this group doesn't have permissions yet to access the OpenAI service. So let's go to our OpenAI service again and go back to our access control. And this time let's go under role assignments and add a role assignment for that group we just created. So in here, you can see there's all kinds of built-in roles that give different permissions and different abilities to whoever we assign them to. So Azure provides a ton of built-in roles with different categories and permissions, and you can also create your own custom roles, but a lot of times you don't have to do that. You can just use these built-in ones. So I'm going to search for open to look for OpenAI roles that are built in. And I've found that this Cognitive Services OpenAI contributor role, this works pretty well. This has a reasonable set of permissions because it's a contributor, not necessarily a super admin or anything like that. So let's pick this OpenAI contributor. And here's where we actually assign that role. So it's going to ask us if we want to assign that to a user, group, or service principal, or a managed identity. We just created a group. Remember our Entra Local AI Devs group. So let's select members. And there's our Local AI Devs. So I'm going to pick that and choose Select. And then let's just review and assign this. So it's going to go ahead and assign that role of OpenAI contributor to the group that our user lives in. So now when we go back to Visual Studio, the user that you're logged into one of your tools with here, whether that's the CLI or Visual Studio, that should now have access to the service through that group. Now, when you're assigning these permissions, this can take a little bit of time to propagate, usually only a few minutes or less, but it can take longer in some circumstances. So I'm just going to run the app and then we'll wait a second to make sure that that gets updated in Azure. So after we give that a minute, let's ask our same question to make sure that this is still working. So I'll say, who is Mario? And if we give that a second, that's going to go out to OpenAI to get our answer. And sure enough, there it is. This is still working. So this is pretty cool. You'll notice we don't have an access key at all in our code. All we have is this default Azure credential, and that's picking up the user that we're signed into Visual Studio with. And then that user lives in a group that has OpenAI contributor permissions on our service in Azure. So locally, this is all working fine now, and there's no more keys in our code, which is great. However, let's see what happens if we actually deploy this out to Azure. So it's great that it works locally, but we need it to work in the cloud and on the web as well. So let's go up to our project here and publish this to an app service real quick. So let's choose Azure, and I'll select Next. And I'm just going to choose App Service for Windows to keep this straightforward. And then we'll create a new instance. So right now we don't have an app service to deploy to, but this can kind of automatically stub one out for us. So it's going to create one called Demo Entra ID based on our project name. And it's going to put that into a resource group. I'm actually just going to create a new resource group to be safe. So I'll put that in a demo AI group here. And it's going to create a new hosting plan. Remember, this is what controls the resources that are available to our app service. And so I'll click Create and give that a moment to run. And once that completes, let's select that and click Finish. And then remember to hit the Publish. People always forget that you have to hit this button. It doesn't actually publish until you click that. So let's give that a moment as well, and then we'll be back in a second. Okay, so our app finished deploying successfully, and Visual Studio will open that up for us automatically. But now let's see what happens when we ask this same question out in Azure. So if I say, who is Mario? This is actually not going to work. And there's our error. Right now our configuration settings are preventing it from displaying the actual error, but we can discover the source of that if we go into our Demo Entra ID app here. So let's make sure that we know what the error here actually is. So let's scroll down to our app service logs. Let's just turn on application logging and save that. And then let's go to our log stream. And this allows us to connect directly to the app log stream and kind of see issues in real time. I just want to show you that this does explain what the error actually is. And if you run into this, this is kind of an easy way to troubleshoot that. So let's go back out to our app and ask this question again. It'll error right away this time. But now when we go into our log stream, you can see there it is. Error, permission denied, principal does not have access to the API operation. And that's because our app out in Azure doesn't have our Visual Studio login credentials or our Azure CLI login credentials. That default Azure credential is looking for some type of managed identity or environment ID to authenticate with, but it's not finding one, and so it's saying the principal doesn't have access. Well, we can fix this by applying that same role that we applied to our local dev group to this app service. And that means our app service needs an identity of its own that we can apply roles to. So if we scroll up to identity under our Demo Entra ID web app here, there's two options to pick from. There's system assigned or user assigned identity. It looks like system assigned is already enabled, so we do have a system assigned ID. And the difference between these two, basically a system assigned ID is just kind of tied directly to the resource, so you can just turn it on and off directly. And if the app service or the resource is destroyed, that ID goes with it and is no longer available. A user-assigned identity, this is something you can actually create separately in Azure and assign roles to it and then associate that user-assigned identity with different resources. It's great for reuse across different resources and things like that, but the system-assigned identity is a simple solution for scenarios like this. So our app does have an identity now. We just have to assign the right permissions to it. So let's go over to our OpenAI service again, and then let's go to Access Control, Role Assignments. Remember, this is where we were before. This is where we assigned our local AI devs group permission. So we want to assign this same Cognitive Services OpenAI contributor role to our managed identity on our app service. So let's say add role assignment again, and let's search for open and pick that OpenAI contributor role again. Now, this time we're not looking for a user or group, we're looking for a managed identity. Remember, we enabled system assigned managed identity on our app service. So let's say select members, and we've got a handful of them to pick from here, but I'm just going to pick this demo Entra ID and then click select. So there's our app service. By default, a system assigned identity will carry the same name as the resource that it was created with. So our identity name is just the name of the app service essentially. And you can see it even tells us that the type is app service. So let's assign this role to our app services managed identity. And it said that was successful, but remember, this can take a few minutes to propagate again. So let's switch back to our app and just give this a second to update in Azure and sync up. All right, so this did end up taking about 5 minutes to sync properly and start working. But sure enough, now if we ask our same question, when I go to hit submit, we'll get our answer back just like we did locally, except this time we're out in Azure and everything is working properly in the cloud. Until it syncs, you will still see that same error, but just give it some time and it should work out. So now we have our app authenticated through Entra ID both locally and in the cloud using this setup. And so to kind of wrap things up and close out the video, there's a couple next steps or additional improvements I would encourage you to explore that we'll discuss briefly here. So if we go back to our app and we look at our code, there's a couple potential improvements here. One is that you'd probably want to move these out into configuration settings or environment variable or something so that they're not hard-coded. But the main thing I wanted to talk about is there's actually one further improvement you could make here. Now, some people do have sort of an issue with default Azure credential, and that's because of the way it searches through those different credential patterns in order. So if we go back here, this can potentially cause an issue when it's automatically kind of just searching for the next available credential. You might end up in a situation where someone logged into an Azure CLI on a VM unexpectedly, or something where it picks up the wrong credential set. In my experience, that's not a super common thing that happens, but if you want to be extra secure, instead of using default Azure credential, you can actually just use like managed identity credential directly, and then this will only pick up managed identities when it's deployed, and you don't have to worry about it picking up the Azure CLI credentials or anything like that. And then to get this working locally, you can set this up with some sort of conditional where if you're running locally, it'll look for Visual Studio credentials, but when it's deployed, it looks for managed identity credential. You essentially just replace default Azure credential with an explicit credential. I believe default Azure credential also lets you exclude credential types that you don't want to include, but just play around with those different credential types and see which ones that you actually want to keep for your environments, or you can just leave default Azure credential here and it'll probably be fine in most cases. I would also recommend looking into that user-assigned identity that I mentioned. Those are a little bit more flexible and reusable than system-assigned identity. And you'll also want to think about whether you want to keep structuring things using Entra groups, or if you want to just assign permissions to your own user directly if you're working by yourself and so on. So there's a couple other areas to explore there, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of the general workflow here to set up your app to work with Microsoft Entra ID between different environments locally and in production or out on the cloud. Please hit subscribe and the like button to support this content, and I'll see you next time right here on the Code Wolf.